Well, our guest today is Lieutenant General Syed Ata Hasnain, who was the former commander of the 15th Corps in Jammu and Kashmir and the former military secretary of the Indian Army. He is with us to talk about the Indian Army. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, you know, we are sitting today and talking about the Indian Army when there's going to be a change in government, there's going to be a new defense minister, there's going to be but there are probably not going to be any changes insofar as policy towards the military is concerned. One of the major issues that seems to be rankling the people at large about the Indian military and the Indian Army is the issue of corruption, because of the big mega deals that are coming out and the scams and the fact that there are all these agents, middlemen who are making money. A couple have been arrested in London, the inquiries against others. Now, how bad is this and how sort of deep-rooted is corruption in the Indian Army?
Okay, let me put it this way, and thank you for this question. Let me put it this way. From the moral angle, there is nothing wrong with the Indian Army. We are a large force. We have a large amount of equipment, and there is a fair amount of procurement which takes place from abroad, from various companies within India. We have our logistics, large part of it in which we do procurement from organizations within India. All this involves money. Now, by and large, I don't think there's a major problem of corruption. But when you have a force as large as this, there will be odd cases where you'll find misdemeanor on the part of dealing officers or anyone of that kind. Since the army is supposed to be and is considered and perceived as one of the most honest organizations with high integrity and very high value system, any odd case which comes to light is obviously blown out of proportion, and that comes into the public domain. And I don't blame them, because the media also then does a lot of witch hunting, and much against the issues which may happen in other organizations, any such issue in the domain of the army or the armed forces gets thrown up and probably gets blown up much more than what it would happen in any other place. So I would say you can't root it out completely.
Has it increased?
I won't say that. You see, as the modernization process is going on, there will be more procurements. Our research and development organizations within India have not been able to keep pace with the modern technology to the extent which would have been desirable. And therefore, we will have to perforce go abroad to get most of our procurement of modern technology as a part of the transformation process which is going on. How much of a hand do the armed forces really have in this itself? I think it's a very integrated kind of a process which happens, involving the bureaucracy, the armed forces themselves, and the political leadership, all three of them in it. To put a finger on the pulse and say who is actually responsible for any such misdemeanor is very, very difficult. And you find that in almost all such inquiries which have taken place, no one has been able to point a finger at the army in clear terms in any of the deals that have happened.
But is that really so, or is it that the army is protecting its own?
No, I don't think that is so. You would have seen that wherever there have been cases, for example, the Tehelka deal itself, which was one of the first issues which came out in the public domain, you saw that it was only the army which carried out a full investigation, a full trial and prosecution of the officers who were involved. No one else who was involved in that whole case ever came out in the public domain as far as what action was taken under that.
But you know, you have two things that are happening, and I think they might have increased, even you'll admit that, is that the middlemen of representing foreign multinationals, which Rajiv Gandhi at one time when he was Prime Minister tried to do away with. I don't know if he was serious, but it never really happened. Two is that retired generals and retired military officers being absorbed by these military arms manufacturing companies. That itself amounts to a certain level of corruption, because the former officers have access to a point which a civilian would not. Now, what do you do about that?
Okay, now you see, lobbying in India is not a legal thing, as you say. Lobbying in many countries abroad is very much illegal. aspect. For in the United States, lobbying is an art and is considered as a profession. Here, we've got our controls to make sure that retired military officers who were involved with the processes while they were in service are not permitted to actually work. For illegally, if they do it, then it is their fault, of course.
Yeah.
And that is something which
Many
we
are
frown
doing
upon,
it actually.
very heavily frowned upon it. There are controls, there are systems. The Ministry of Defence lays down very clear rules and guiding principles on this, that a person who's involved with a particular company or with any particular process while he was in service will not be allowed to work, and all such people are required to take permission before they actually start working for companies. Having said that, I think facilitating and liaison work can be very professional. It can be very professional, it can be very transparent. I think in our country itself, if you make it legal and if you allow people to come in and actually have guidelines for them, perhaps to some extent this problem itself will be overcome. Because I think military men, senior officers have got a measure of what exactly are the requirements. They understand technology, they understand the field requirements of the equipment which is to be fielded. So as the go-betweens between companies, between the vendors and the armed forces, they are actually doing a very good job. But it's a question of how to ensure there is transparency and how there is effective control on this. There is a new defense procurement manual which has come out only recently during the time of the current government. I think it has put many of the procedures in place, and you will find that there are so many deals taking place that it's an odd case which will come out, which you will find there has been some case of misdemeanor. But unfortunately, it is that case which then paints the entire process as something which is red. And I think that is rather unfortunate.
There's this general perception also arising from this whole issue of corruption and the fact, these mega scams and action being taken after that, that there is a sort of a go slow policy adopted by the current government insofar as procurements are concerned, and files are not really being passed in the manner that they should. One. Two, you also keep hearing all the time about very acute shortages in equipment, which really raises the question of whether the army is fighting fit in terms of equipment and weaponry.
Very interesting. That's a very interesting question. And only yesterday, if you notice in the media, it has come out where the Chief of the Army and Staff has said that we will probably be able to make up our war wastage rates levels of ammunition only by the year 2019.
Exactly.
If we have the full budgetary support of the Government of India. Now, this is a serious thing, there's no doubt. During the early part of the millennium, I think funding was not such a major problem. And although we never hit the desired percentage of defense budgeting, which is, I would say, about 3%, which is what is there in Pakistan and in China, which is meandering between 3 and 4%. In India, we have come down rock bottom this time to approximately 1.7% and even less. So firstly, it's a question of funding today. Do you have enough funds? Secondly, it's a question of if you have the funds, are your procedures smart enough to ensure that the funding process ensures that at the end of the financial year, you do not have money which is pending unnecessarily and which has to be returned. Unfortunately, there has been a tendency in the recent past where you find that the Army's unutilized capital budget or the armed forces unutilized capital budget is something for which the government depends, that this will be the money which will be available to be able to accommodate other so-called deals dealing with the people, right? Now, this is an unfortunate thing, and there has to be a procedure, there has to be a process by which we have to ensure that capital budgets are allowed to flow over and do not go into other domains. Secondly, it's a question of procedures. I agree that there has been a level where risk-taking has come down to a very great extent. In all such dealings, or rather deals, a level of risk will always have to be taken. You cannot be 100% sure that the equipment that you have contracted will be exactly what will finally fetch up and how it will perform in field, etc. it is better to have 80% capability or 80% effectiveness of that equipment rather than delaying that entire thing for a couple of years. And that is something, unfortunately, which the policy makers have not been able to correctly define.
There seems to be this disconnect
Yes.
between the policymaker, the
Absolutely.
military, the requirements,
Absolutely.
and in between the bureaucrat.
Absolutely. The case of, for example, the case of the artillery guns. Since 1987, Bofors, I think the army has been crying hoarse. In 1999, it was proved I think to a very large extent during the Kargil operation that the Bofors gun was an outstanding gun. Whatever may have happened to its the procedures of acquiring the guns, it was an outstanding gun. But ever since, the whole decision on guns has been pending. And now today we are in a crying need where we find we just don't have the right quantum of artillery available to us. And
Terrible.
with the raising of the mountain corps for the east again, we don't have enough mountain guns available to us, light howitzers available to us. So there is a crisis. There is a crisis virtually at the moment, and I only hope that we find a very, very early solution to this, because it must not reach crisis proportions actually.
And the other thing where there also seems to be an imminent crisis is in terms of the fact that people are not wanting to join the army, and also that you've lost a lot of officers and you're not getting the kind of quality that you can promote to senior positions.
That's a very interesting question again. This is a issue. This is a social issue actually. I'll take you back to 1991 when the economy started opening up and the corporate world came into being with a greater footprint inside India. And obviously a lot of talent started gravitating towards the corporate world, where there was a requirement of technology, there was a requirement of management. Those people who would perhaps have been natural candidates to come to the armed forces. And you found a dwindling of quality in terms of education, etc. But I can assure you the armed forces are adept at taking in reasonable quality people and converting them into high quality people. One thing that the armed forces have not done is to dilute the standards of intake. We have got enough people wanting to come into the army. Let me assure you this. It's a question that at the selection level, we do not find the right quality. And despite the fact that our training is so intense, despite that, we have not diluted our standards of intake. Today, we have a shortage of approximately 22% in the army. With the way the raisings are taking place, now the Mountain Strike Corps is coming in, Assam Rifles units are being raised, many of our strategic units are lacking officers and therefore they need more officers. You won't find a solution to this problem so early, but I can give you one positive input, and that is that we have expanded our training capacity. Today, we can train almost about 2,700 officers, cadets in a year to become officers, right? That's a fairly good intake. As against a retirement average of about 11 to 1,200 every year. We've got, in the last 1 year, 2 years, we've got about 2,200 coming in. So we are on the plus side.
But there's also a problem. A lot of the people who are coming in want short service commission. They don't want to serve the entire term. Many leave midway.
In fact, that is a very good thing if it happens, because we need more short service people. We need more short service people. But the short service is not attractive enough at the moment. What you need is people coming in after 5 years. If they wish to exit, they must exit with some kind of a package available to them. If they wish to exit after 10 years or 14 years, these are prime ages at which they are exiting. They've got families to look after. They've got to probably gain greater expertise to be able to acquire new jobs. They must have some modicum of assurance that jobs will be available to them. There's a thing which had been recommended by a very high-profile committee called the AVC committee, which said for short service officers there should be a thing called the peel factor, which means that 5, 10 or 14 years service they should be able to leave into assured jobs in the government. That has not come into being in the last 10, 12 years. So I think a lot needs to be done by the armed forces in conjunction with other departments of the government to be able to resolve this personnel issue.
Okay, to a last point, politicization of the army. Two ways. One is that, of course, we've already discussed the fact that you're not getting the, or you are getting the officers or not getting the officers. So there is a certain argument which is that you're not elite enough anymore and your base is now shifted to the rural areas. So does that make for an army which is a little bit more inclined or more susceptible to political influence?
I won't agree with that entirely. Let me put it in a slightly different way. From elitism, from the urban elitism, a transformation to rural intake, I don't think it affects the quality of leadership in the army. If you would have seen in 1999 in the Kargil operations, most of the major operations in the Kashmir Valley led by younger officers of the Rashtriya Rifles, many of them have been from the rural stock and they have done outstanding service for the nation. So I wouldn't entirely agree with that. Second thing, I think this whole issue of politicization recently in the last few months has come into being, or rather the finger is being pointed towards the army, primarily because many of the senior officers and other officers have suddenly taken to joining political parties and are participating in elections.
Absolutely.
I think it's a natural growth process of a nation.
But shouldn't there be a cooling off period?
Well, cooling off periods in the sense,
Which you don't seem to have anymore, whether it's RAW, whether it's the army, whether it's the home ministry.
I think it's a part of a democratic process. Why should, after all, anyone who serves the armed forces of India, serves the bureaucracy for that matter, all of them are doing service to the nation. And after that, immediately on exit, if they are a part of a democratic setup, why shouldn't they have the right to be able to stand for elections? That I don't think contributes to politicization in any way. What I would be worried about politicization is influence of politicians or parties or ideologies within the serving ranks of the army. Now that is something which I would frown upon in a very
But it's there. I mean, if I'm the army chief and I leave, I retire and join a particular party, it is very, it can be said with a great degree of credibility that in my last couple of years, I was actually working in my mind or with that party, you know. I mean, it's not something that's an isolated instance.
That's a questionable thing. You see, every human being has got the right and the freedom. If you belong to a democratic country, you have the right and the freedom to have the ideology of the party that you wish to support. And while you're in service, this is something which we frown upon in a very big way in the army. You're not supposed to display that anyway. For example, we have a great tradition in the army that, for example, in the officers' mess, you never discuss politics. You can only discuss your profession or some light-hearted things, but never discuss politics ever. Now, these are the kind of values and traditions which we must continue to hold forth in the army. I would always frown upon any case where officers are found to be dabbling in politics while serving with the army itself.
Well, thank you so much for this also, General Hasnain.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.